I hired a young guy named Silas to mow the lawn while my daughter and her husband were away. About an hour into the job, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting a question about the sprinkler system. Instead, Silas whispered, "Mr. Harlan, is anyone else in the house right now?" I set down my coffee mug and asked what he meant. He took a shaky breath and said, "I hear crying coming from your basement. That is not a television." I told him to step away from the house and wait by his truck. I did not panic. I did not call the police just yet. I paid my diner tab and drove home. Before I tell you what I found behind that locked basement door, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that true family is built on respect, not just blood. My name is Harlan. I am 73 years old, a retired civil engineer, and a man who has spent his entire life measuring loads, calculating stress points, and ensuring foundations are strong enough to withstand disasters. For the past decade, I have lived a quiet, structured life on my suburban estate. The property is large enough to afford me my peace, featuring a primary residence where I live and a newly renovated guest house across the driveway. That guest house is currently occupied by my daughter Delia and her husband Bryce. They moved in 3 years ago, under the guise of keeping an eye on me as I got older. I knew the truth, of course. Bryce liked to project the image of a highly successful logistics entrepreneur, driving leased luxury cars and wearing suits that cost more than my first mortgage. But I spent 20 years of my career as a forensic auditor for the state before I retired. I know how to read the subtle signs of a man drowning in debt. I let them stay because of my grandson, Micah. Micah is 15, brilliant, quiet, and the absolute light of my life. He has a mind for systems and code, much like my mind for blueprints and concrete. This particular Saturday morning was supposed to be completely empty. Delia and Bryce had packed their designer luggage on Friday afternoon, kissing me on the cheek and telling me they were heading to the city for a mandatory weekend corporate retreat. They told me Micah had already been dropped off early that morning for a prestigious month-long summer coding camp at a university 2 states over. They even showed me a printed itinerary. I had hugged my daughter, shook Bryce's hand, and wished them a productive trip. I spent my Saturday morning exactly as I always do, sitting in the corner booth of the local diner, drinking black coffee, and reading the physical newspaper. The diner was filled with the low hum of regular patrons, the clatter of silverware, and the smell of bacon and old wood. It was my sanctuary, a place where the equations of my life balanced perfectly. Then my cell phone vibrated against the laminate table. It was Silas, a hard-working college kid I hired to keep the estate grounds looking sharp. I answered, expecting him to ask if he should trim the hedges near the guest house or leave them be. Instead, I heard the uneven, frantic breathing of a young man who was genuinely frightened. "Sir," he whispered, the sound barely carrying over the diner noise. "Is anyone else in the house right now?" I asked him to clarify. He told me he was edging the grass near the small ground-level basement windows at the back of my primary residence. He said he had turned off the weed whacker to clear some debris and heard a sound. "I hear crying, Mr. Harlan, from your basement, and it is not a television. It sounds real. It sounds like a kid." The chill that ran down my spine was not the panic of an old man. It was the cold, calculating focus of an auditor, realizing the numbers on the ledger were a complete fabrication. My house was supposed to be entirely empty. The basement was essentially a massive storage space, half of which Bryce had recently insisted on renovating. He claimed he needed a secure, climate-controlled room to store expensive business inventory, and sensitive logistical servers. He had even installed a heavy-duty smart lock on the reinforced door, telling me it was a requirement for his business insurance. I had allowed it because I rarely went down there anymore, my knees preferring the ground floor. But now, Silas was standing outside that very room, hearing the muffled sounds of human despair. I told Silas to step back, get to his truck, lock the doors, and wait for me. I did not ask questions. I did not call Delia or Bryce. When a structure is compromised, you do not call the architect who poured the faulty concrete. You go inspect the cracks yourself. I left a $20 bill on the diner table, walked out to my truck, and drove the 4 miles to my estate, in absolute silence. My mind was running through variables. A break-in, a squatter, but the neighborhood was secure, and my alarm system had not been tripped. When I pulled into the sweeping driveway, Silas was standing by his pickup, his face pale. I gave him a nod, signaling him to stay put, and walked to my front door. The house was deadbolted. I used my master key to enter the foyer. The silence inside was thick, almost suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I walked down the hallway to the basement door. I opened it and descended the wooden stairs, my hand gripping the railing tight. As I reached the bottom, I stood in the dim light of the unfinished half of the basement. I held my breath and listened. Silas was right. It was a soft, ragged sound. The sound of someone who had been crying for so long that their throat was raw, trying desperately to muffle their own sobs. The sound was coming from behind Bryce's newly installed reinforced security door. I stepped up to the door and knocked firmly. The crying stopped instantly, replaced by a terrified, suffocating silence. I called out, identifying myself. I said, "This is Harlan. I own this house. Who is in there?" A small, trembling voice leaked through the heavy wood. "Grandpa." The word hit me with the force of a wrecking ball. It was Micah, my 15-year-old grandson. The boy who was supposed to be hundreds of miles away, learning how to build software. I reached for the smart lock keypad, but the screen was dead, intentionally deactivated, or locked from an admin account on Bryce's phone. There was no keyhole. Bryce had designed it to be impenetrable, without the digital handshake. But Bryce was a logistics manager, and I am a civil engineer. I know that no matter how smart a lock is, it is only as strong as the wood holding the hinges. I turned around and walked back up the stairs. I did not run, because rushing leads to mistakes. I went to my garage, unlocked my primary tool chest, and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar, a heavy-duty flathead screwdriver, and a sledgehammer. I descended the basement stairs for the second time, the weight of the steel in my hands feeling like the weight of the judgment I was about to bring down on my own family. I approached the door. I told Micah to step back, to go to the far wall and cover his ears. I wedged the heavy screwdriver under the top hinge pin and struck it upward with the sledgehammer. It popped out with a sharp metallic crack. I repeated the process on the middle and bottom hinges. The smart lock held the other side of the door tight to the frame, but the hinge side was now free. I jammed the crowbar into the gap where the hinges used to be, braced my boots against the concrete floor, and threw all my 73 years of leverage into the steel bar. The wood splintered, groaned, and finally gave way with a violent snap. I pulled the heavy door backward, sliding it out of the frame entirely, and letting it crash to the concrete floor. The smell hit me first. Stale air, fear, and the metallic scent of an enclosed, unventilated space. I reached in and flicked on the overhead light. The room was not filled with expensive logistical servers. or business inventory. It was completely empty, save for a single cot in the corner, a bucket, and a few scattered bottles of water. Sitting on the cot, clutching his knees to his chest, was Micah. He was pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his clothes wrinkled and damp with sweat. He was clutching a dark green duffel bag to his chest, like a shield. When the light hit him, he flinched, squeezing his eyes shut before slowly opening them to look at me. The terror in his expression was something I will never unsee. It was not the fear of a monster under the bed. It was the profound, soul-crushing terror of a child who realizes the monsters are the people who are supposed to protect him. I dropped the crowbar. The clang of the steel on concrete echoed in the small room. I walked over to him, dropping to one knee despite the sharp ache in my joints. I reached out slowly and placed a hand on his shoulder. He collapsed forward into my arms, sobbing with a ferocity that shook his entire body. I held my grandson tight, letting him cry, letting the reality of the situation settle into the cold, analytical part of my brain. I did not ask him if he was okay. It was obvious he was not. I asked him how long he had been down here. He managed to catch his breath, wiping his face with the back of his trembling hand. "Since yesterday morning," he whispered. "They never took me to camp, Grandpa. They woke me up, told me we were going to the car, and then Dad grabbed my phone. He shoved me down here and locked the door. He said I was grounded. He said, if I made a sound, things would be much worse when they got back." I felt my jaw clench. The rage building inside me was not a roaring fire. It was absolute zero. It was the temperature at which steel shatters. I asked him why his parents would do something so extreme, so completely detached from any rational form of punishment. Micah looked down at the duffel bag in his lap. His hands were shaking as he unzipped the top compartment. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of printed papers and a small silver flash drive. "Because I saw his laptop, Grandpa," Micah said, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper, as if he expected Bryce to materialize from the shadows. "I was trying to fix the Wi-Fi router in the guest house. Dad left his computer open on the kitchen counter. I saw his emails. I saw the bank statements. I saw the documents with your signature on them. But you did not sign them, Grandpa. I know your handwriting. I pointed it out to them. I told them I was going to call you. That is when Dad grabbed me." The immediate conflict snapped into brutal focus. Micah was not locked in the basement as a twisted disciplinary measure. He was locked down here as a prisoner. He was a witness to a crime, silenced and hidden away by his own parents, so they could complete a transaction without interference. My daughter, the girl I had raised, and the man she married, had turned my basement into a holding cell for their own son. They had looked me in the eye, smiled, hugged me, and told me he was safely at camp while he was suffocating in the dark, just a few yards below my feet. I looked at the stack of papers in Micah's hand. Even in the dim light of the basement, I could recognize the formatting of a commercial real estate contract. They had forged my signature. They were selling my estate, the very ground we were standing on, to cover the massive, gaping hole of Bryce's bankrupt existence, and they had sacrificed their own child to ensure the deal went through. I stood up, pulling Micah to his feet. I kept my hand firmly on his shoulder, projecting a calm certainty that I knew he desperately needed to feel. I told him we were leaving this room and never looking back. The peace of my Saturday morning was gone forever. The quiet retirement I had earned was over. Delia and Bryce believed they had neutralized every threat to their plan. They believed they had outsmarted a 73-year-old man and silenced a 15-year-old boy. I spent my life analyzing structural failures, identifying where the rot hides in the concrete, and pulling down buildings that were no longer safe to stand. My family was a compromised structure, and it was time for the demolition. I brought Micah up the wooden stairs, keeping my hand planted firmly on his back. The boy was trembling so violently that I could feel the vibrations radiating through his thin cotton shirt. Each step we took away from that basement felt incredibly heavy. The main floor of my house was bathed in the warm, bright sunlight of a perfect Saturday morning. The contrast was sickening. Outside my windows, the world was peaceful. Birds were chirping, the neighborhood was quiet, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. But inside my home, the very foundation of my family had just been completely pulverized. I guided him into the kitchen and pulled out one of the heavy oak bar stools at the island. I told him to sit. He collapsed into the seat, dropping the green duffel bag onto the granite countertop, as if it weighed 100 pounds. I walked over to the cabinet, pulled down a tall glass, and filled it with cold water from the refrigerator dispenser. I set it in front of him. He stared at it for a long moment before wrapping both hands around the glass, his knuckles white, and taking a long, desperate drink. I watched him closely. His eyes were darting around the room, still trapped in the panic of the last 24 hours. He looked exhausted, dehydrated, and utterly broken. I took the stool next to him. I did not push him to speak immediately. I have conducted countless interviews and audits with people who were hiding terrible truths, and I knew that silence is often the best tool to calm a frantic mind. You give them space to breathe, and eventually the words will spill out. After a few minutes, the trembling in his shoulders began to subside. He took another sip of water and looked at me. His eyes were welling up with fresh tears. He told me he was sorry. He apologized for looking at things that did not belong to him. I stopped him right there. I kept my voice low and steady, telling him he had absolutely nothing to apologize for. I told him that uncovering a lie is never a crime, no matter how ugly the truth turns out to be. I asked him to take a deep breath and tell me exactly what happened before they locked him in that room. Micah rubbed his eyes and began to explain. It started on Friday morning. Delia and Bryce had asked him to go over to the guest house to reset the wireless network router because the internet connection was dropping. Micah is a brilliant kid. He understands hardware and systems better than most adults. He walked over to their place while they were busy packing their bags in the bedroom. He found the router on the kitchen counter, sitting right next to Bryce's open laptop. Micah said he did not intend to snoop, but the screen was bright, and the documents left open were not typical logistics spreadsheets. They were legal documents. The bold headings caught his attention. He saw the words irrevocable transfer, warranty deed, and escrow disbursement. Because he is my grandson, he has my analytical mind. He leaned in closer. He saw the address of my estate listed at the top of the screen. Then he saw the purchase price, a number large enough to make his stomach drop. And finally, he saw my signature at the bottom of the last page. I listened intently, not interrupting. Micah told me he recognized the signature immediately. He said it looked like my handwriting, but it was too perfectly smooth. It lacked the slight hesitation I always have when I write. He knew it was a forgery. He started looking through the open windows on the screen. He found emails from a commercial real estate developer in the city. The developer was planning to bulldoze the entire property, my primary residence, and the guest house, to build a sprawling luxury condominium complex. The emails discussed a rapid closing process, expedited cash transfers, and a complete buyout of the land. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My daughter and her husband were not just stealing money from my accounts. They were selling the ground beneath my feet. They were selling the home where my late wife and I had raised Delia, the home where we had celebrated every holiday, the home I had planned to leave to Micah. They were liquidating our entire family history to cover up Bryce's financial failures. I asked Micah what happened next. His voice cracked as he described the moment Bryce walked into the kitchen. Bryce saw him looking at the screen. Micah said Bryce did not yell. Instead, his face went completely blank, devoid of any emotion. Bryce walked over, slammed the laptop shut, and asked Micah what he was doing. Micah, being young and terrified but fiercely loyal to me, told Bryce that he knew the signature was fake. He told Bryce he was going to march straight across the driveway and tell me everything. That is when the nightmare truly began. Micah described how Bryce grabbed him by the arm, squeezing so hard it left bruises. Bryce dragged him out the back door of the guest house and forced him across the lawn toward the primary residence. Micah tried to fight back, but Bryce was too strong. They entered the house through the back patio door. Delia was waiting in the hallway. Micah looked at me, tears spilling down his cheeks, and told me the most heartbreaking part of the entire story. He said he looked at his mother and begged her to stop Bryce. He cried out to Delia, asking her what they were doing. Delia did not help him. My daughter, the girl I had loved and protected my entire life, simply turned her head away. She told Micah that he needed to stay quiet. She told him that Bryce was just doing what had to be done to save their family. She chose her husband and his stolen money over the safety and well-being of her own child. He shoved him into the newly renovated storage room, threw a duffel bag with a blanket and a few bottles of water inside, and told him he was grounded for invading their privacy. Bryce said they would deal with his punishment when they returned from their trip. Then Bryce closed the heavy reinforced door, and Micah heard the smart lock engage. The darkness and the silence swallowed him whole. I sat there at the kitchen island, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their cruelty. They had left their own son locked in a windowless room, terrified and alone, while they smiled to my face and told me he was happily coding at a summer camp. They had orchestrated this entire weekend to ensure I would not go looking for him, and they would have the time they needed to finalize their theft. I needed to know the timeline. I placed my hand over Micah's trembling fingers and asked him one very specific question. I asked him where they were right now. They were supposed to be at a corporate retreat, but clearly that was another fabrication. Micah sniffled, reached into his duffel bag, and pulled out the thick stack of papers he had managed to grab before Bryce slammed the laptop shut. He slid the papers across the smooth granite counter toward me. "They are not at a retreat, Grandpa," Micah whispered. "They are in the city. I saw the calendar invite on the screen. They have a private appointment at a title office downtown." I looked down at the papers. The top sheet was a confirmation of a real estate closing. The date listed was today. The time listed was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was currently 11:30 in the morning. My daughter and her husband were sitting in a high-rise office building right now, drinking sparkling water, smiling at lawyers, and preparing to sign away my life. They believed they had silenced the only witness. They believed the old man was sitting in a diner, clueless and compliant. The forensic auditor inside me woke up completely, pushing aside the grief of a heartbroken father. I had exactly 3.5 hours to dismantle their operation. I looked at Micah. I told him he was incredibly brave. I told him he had done the right thing, and that he was never going back to that basement, and he was never going back to them. The interrogation was over. The facts were laid bare on the kitchen counter. The time for mourning the daughter I used to know had passed. It was time to go to work. I spread the papers out across the cool granite surface of the kitchen island. My hands moved with the practiced precision of a man who had spent his entire career examining financial discrepancies. The documents were thick and full of dense legal terminology, but to me, they read like a children's book. I did not need to decipher the jargon. I went straight to the numbers and the authorized signatures. The buyer listed on the contract was a massive regional commercial development group. They were a company known for buying up large residential plots, leveling the existing structures, and pouring acres of concrete for high-density retail spaces. They did not want my home. They wanted my land. I looked at the purchase price at the bottom of the second page. The number was astronomical. It was enough money to solve almost any problem a person could ever create. And right below that number, resting on the final line, was my name. The ink was dark and bold. To a casual observer, it was a flawless reproduction of my handwriting. The loops and the slants were almost perfectly mimicking the way I had signed my name for decades. But an auditor sees what others miss. I saw the lack of fluidity. I saw the slight hesitations where the pen lingered too long on the paper. The uneven pressure, where the forger had to concentrate to match my style. It was a calculated, deliberate fake. I asked Micah how bad the financial situation truly was. I needed to understand the exact scope of the disaster my daughter and her husband had built. Micah kept his hands wrapped tightly around his glass of water and told me everything he had uncovered. Bryce was completely bankrupt. The successful logistics company Bryce constantly bragged about had not turned a profit in over 2 years. Micah explained that Bryce had lost his biggest client a long time ago and had been taking out massive, high-interest loans to keep up the appearance of wealth. The luxury cars parked in my driveway, the tailored suits, the expensive dinners, they were all funded by money Bryce did not actually have. Micah had noticed the cracks in their facade months ago. He told me he used to empty the trash in the guest house and would find final notice warnings from banks and collection agencies shredded at the bottom of the bin. Bryce had borrowed money from aggressive private lenders, the kind of people who do not send polite letters when you miss a payment. The debt had ballooned into a multi-million-dollar deficit. Bryce was drowning, and the water was rising fast. I asked him how Delia fit into this nightmare. A part of me, the fragile, hopeful part of a father, wanted to believe that my daughter was completely in the dark. I wanted to believe that Bryce had manipulated her, that she was just another victim of his financial deceit. But Micah shattered that hope with a quiet, trembling voice. He told me his mother knew absolutely everything. In fact, she was the one managing the incoming collection calls. She was the one hiding the mail. Micah explained how he had seen them sitting at the dining room table, late at night, surrounded by past-due bills. He had watched from the hallway as they panicked over a notice of default. They were desperate. They needed a massive influx of cash, and they needed it immediately. They had exhausted all their credit lines and alienated anyone who might lend them money. They had nowhere left to turn. That was when they decided to sell my estate. Micah told me he had found a stack of discarded paper in the recycling bin earlier that week. The pages were covered in my name. Bryce and Delia had spent hours practicing my signature, tracing it over and over, until they could replicate it with enough accuracy to fool a lazy clerk. They had found an unethical public notary in the city. someone willing to stamp the documents without requiring my physical presence. They had orchestrated a complete transfer of my property, entirely bypassing my authority. The plan was devious in its simplicity. They were going to finalize the closing this afternoon, take the enormous wire transfer from the commercial developer, and use it to instantly erase their mountain of debt. They would pay off the private lenders and the banks, wiping their slate clean with the money from my life's work. I asked Micah what they planned to do with me once the sale was complete. He shook his head, his eyes filling with tears again. He said he read their text messages on the laptop. They were planning to tell me that the bank had foreclosed on the property due to a clerical error with my property taxes. They were going to feign shock and outrage, pretending to be victims alongside me. Then, playing the role of the devoted children, they would offer to move me into a small, state-funded assisted living facility. They were going to pack me away in a tiny room, convince me that I had lost my own home through my own negligence, and walk away free and clear. The sheer malice of their scheme settled over me like a heavy winter chill. They were not just stealing my home, they were planning to steal my dignity. They wanted to make me believe I had failed, that my mind was slipping, and that I had ruined my own retirement. They were willing to gaslight a 73-year-old man into believing he was incompetent, all to cover their own greed and failure. I looked at my grandson. He was a 15-year-old boy, carrying the burden of knowing his parents were entirely corrupt. He had lost his family in a matter of days, forced to confront the reality that the people who were supposed to guide him were nothing more than common thieves. My heart ached for him. I knew the pain of losing a child to greed, but he was experiencing the trauma of losing his parents to it. I took a slow, deep breath, reining in the sorrow, and letting the cold, analytical focus take over completely. The numbers were clear. The motive was established. The method of the fraud was fully documented in the forged papers resting on my kitchen island. Bryce and Delia were currently sitting in a downtown office, believing they had orchestrated the perfect crime. They thought they had tied up every loose end. They thought locking their son in a basement would guarantee their success, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated the boy they locked away, and they had severely underestimated me. I am not a helpless old man. I spent 20 years untangling complex financial fraud, tracing stolen money through shell companies, and dismantling criminal enterprises built on fake documents. They had tried to steal from an auditor, and they had left a paper trail a mile wide. I folded the forged contract and placed it carefully into my jacket pocket. The grief was still there, a dull ache in the center of my chest, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of duty. I had to protect my grandson. I had to secure my estate, and I had to ensure that Bryce and Delia faced the absolute maximum consequences for their actions. The time for questions was over. We had a timeline to beat, and a closing to stop. I told Micah to grab his bag. It was time to execute a silent adjustment of our own. I asked Micah to walk me through the exact moment they forced him down those stairs. I needed to understand the mechanics of their deception. Micah swallowed hard. His voice was fragile, but he pushed through the fear. He told me that when Bryce dragged him into the primary residence, his phone was still in his front pocket. He had instinctively reached for it, hoping to dial my number or even emergency services. But Bryce was faster. Bryce slammed him against the hallway wall, not hard enough to break bones, but with enough force to knock the breath completely out of his lungs. Bryce reached into Micah's pocket and pulled out the phone. He did not just take it. He looked Micah dead in the eye, placed the phone on the hardwood floor, and crushed it under the heel of his leather shoe. The sound of the glass shattering was the moment Micah realized this was not a standard disciplinary action. This was a hostage situation. Delia watched the entire thing happen. Micah looked at me with a pain so deep it made my own chest ache. He said his mother did not even flinch when the phone crunched under Bryce's boot. She simply reached down, gathered the shattered pieces of plastic and glass, and threw them into the kitchen garbage can. She told Micah that he was being completely unreasonable. She told him that he was jeopardizing their entire future over a misunderstanding. She framed his discovery of their massive financial fraud as an act of teenage rebellion. She was gaslighting her own child, trying to convince him that his attempt to save his grandfather was actually an act of betrayal against his parents. The psychological cruelty of that moment was staggering. They were systematically dismantling his reality to protect their own lies. After the phone was destroyed, Bryce marched Micah down to the basement. Micah pleaded with them the entire way. He promised he would not say anything. He promised he would stay in his room. He just begged them not to lock him in the dark. But Bryce was a man operating on pure, unadulterated panic, disguised as authority. He shoved Micah into the unfinished storage room. Delia stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at them. She told Micah that they would bring him food and water before they left for the city. She said they just needed a few days to get the money sorted out, and then everything would go back to normal. She actually smiled at him. She smiled at her 15-year-old son as she helped her husband turn a basement storage unit into a cell. Bryce closed the heavy reinforced door, and the smart lock engaged with a heavy metallic thud. Micah told me he spent the first hour throwing his entire body weight against the wood, screaming for help, until his vocal cords were raw and bleeding. But the door was designed to keep thieves out, which meant it was perfectly engineered to keep a desperate teenager in. The basement walls were thick concrete, absorbing every sound he made. He said he eventually collapsed on the floor, surrounded by pitch-black darkness, and wept. He cried for his destroyed phone. He cried for the parents he realized he never truly knew, and he cried because he knew exactly what their plan was for me. I asked him how they managed to coordinate the lie about the summer coding camp. Micah explained that the camp was a real program. I had paid the tuition for it months ago, eager to support his interest in software development. The drop-off was scheduled for that very Friday morning. Micah said Delia came down to the basement a few hours after they locked him inside. She opened the door just enough to slide in a small duffel bag with a few bottles of water, a loaf of bread, and a jar of peanut butter. She looked at him huddled in the corner and told him the official story. She said they were going to drive his packed suitcases to the university campus and check him in at the registration desk using his forged medical forms. They would leave his bags in the assigned dorm room, so it looked like he had arrived, and simply wandered off to an orientation session. Then Delia told Micah they would drive back to the estate, park their luxury cars in the driveway, and walk over to my house to say goodbye. They had rehearsed their lines perfectly. They would tell me the drop-off went smoothly, that Micah was thrilled about the camp, and that he had already made friends with his roommate. They would smile, hug me, and tell me they were heading off to their fake corporate retreat in the city. Micah sat in the dark basement eating dry bread, knowing that his mother was actively building a wall of lies around his grandfather. He knew that I was sitting upstairs completely oblivious, believing my family was happy and successful, while my grandson was trapped beneath my feet and my life savings were being actively stolen. The level of premeditation required for this deception was chilling. They did not just stumble into this crime. They planned every single step with the cold precision of seasoned criminals. They used my love for my grandson against me, weaponizing his summer camp as the perfect alibi to remove him from the board. They knew I would not call him on his first day of camp, wanting to give him space to adjust and make friends. They knew I would trust Delia when she told me he arrived safely. They manipulated every variable to ensure I remained completely docile and unaware while they sold my home to a commercial developer. Micah told me the worst part of the lockdown was not the cold floor or the stale air. The worst part was the fear that they might never come back for him. He sat in the dark, his mind racing through terrifying scenarios. What if the deal fell through and Bryce decided to flee the country? What if Delia was too afraid to confess what they had done? He wondered if he would simply be left down there to starve while they escaped with the forged money. He said he kept listening for my footsteps above him, praying I would come down to the basement to check the electrical panel or look for an old tool. But the hours dragged on, and the silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. He realized that they had created the perfect trap. No one was looking for him, because everyone who cared about him believed he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Hearing him describe that agonizing isolation ignited a protective fury deep inside my chest. I have spent my life building structures designed to keep people safe. I spent my career auditing systems to ensure honesty and transparency. Yet the two people I allowed into my inner circle had bypassed all my defenses and targeted the most vulnerable point in my life. They used my grandson as collateral damage in their desperate bid to escape their own failures. They broke his spirit, crushed his sense of safety, and locked him in a cage, all while drinking coffee in my kitchen and smiling at me. I looked at Micah. The trembling had stopped, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. He had survived the darkest 24 hours of his young life, and he had done it with a bravery that humbled me. He had not given up. He had held on to this evidence. He had trusted that if he could just get the truth into my hands, I would know how to fix it. He believed in me, and I was not about to let him down. I gathered the forged documents from the granite counter and folded them neatly. The shock was over. The grief was pushed aside. The clock was ticking, and it was time to move. I told Micah to stay seated at the kitchen island. I pointed to the fruit bowl and told him to eat an apple to get some sugar into his system. He nodded. His eyes tracked my every movement, like a frightened animal, waiting for the next loud noise. I promised him I would only be gone for a minute. I turned and walked down the long, sunlit hallway toward my home office. My office has always been my sanctuary. It is a room built on order, logic, and precision. The walls are lined with floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves holding decades of engineering manuals, auditing textbooks, and binders full of structural schematics. Behind the center bookshelf, concealed behind a seamless wooden panel, is a heavy steel wall safe. It is a high-grade security box. It is the kind of safe you buy when you spend 20 years tracing stolen money and understand exactly how vulnerable physical assets can be. I slid the wooden panel aside. The keypad was dark. I punched in the 6-digit combination. The heavy locking mechanism clicked, and I pulled the heavy steel door open. I did not gasp. I simply stared at the empty metal shelves. The thick, fireproof envelopes that held the original embossed deeds to the estate were gone. The historical property surveys were gone. The master financial ledgers, the physical records of my entire retirement portfolio, were completely missing. They had left nothing but a few obsolete tax returns from 10 years ago. It was useless paperwork they knew they did not need. I stood there in the quiet of my office, feeling the sheer invasive violation of it all. Bryce and Delia had not just forged a digital document on a laptop. They had physically breached my sanctuary. They had systematically gathered the original notarized backups to present to the commercial developer and the title company. They knew that a high-value commercial transaction would require physical verification, and they had methodically stripped my safe to provide it. They must have watched me input the combination over the past few months, patiently memorizing the keystrokes, waiting for the perfect moment to rob me blind. I looked over at the heavy brass clock sitting on my mahogany desk. The large black hands rested exactly at 11:30. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the forged contract Micah had salvaged. My eyes scanned down the page until I found the closing details. The appointment at the title office downtown was scheduled for 3 o'clock sharp. I did the math in my head. I had exactly 3 hours and 30 minutes, 3.5 hours. That was all the time remaining before my own daughter sat in a high-rise conference room, smiled at a team of corporate lawyers, and signed away the land I bought 40 years ago. 3.5 hours before millions of dollars were irrevocably wired into Bryce's failing commercial accounts, instantly transferring my life savings into the hands of the dangerous private lenders he owed. Once that wire transfer cleared, the money would be laundered through untraceable debt payments, and my estate would be legally owned by a development group ready to bring in the bulldozers. A weaker man might have collapsed into the leather desk chair and wept. A more impulsive man might have grabbed the phone, called the police, and started screaming about a stolen house. But I did not yell. I did not throw anything. I gently pushed the heavy steel door of the safe until it clicked shut. I slid the oak panel back into place, concealing the empty vault. I stood perfectly still, controlling the rhythm of my breathing. In through the nose and out through the mouth. This is what I call the silent adjustment. It is the exact moment when the shock of a catastrophe fades, and the cold, unyielding reality of the situation takes over. I was no longer just a betrayed father, mourning the loss of his family. I was a retired forensic auditor who had spent 2 decades taking down corrupt city officials, embezzling contractors, and corporate thieves. I had spent my life dissecting fraudulent schemes, much more sophisticated than the sloppy, desperate theft Bryce and Delia were attempting. They were amateurs, playing a high-stakes game, assuming that their target was a gullible, senile old man. They were wrong. I walked back to my desk and picked up my truck keys. The timeline was incredibly tight, but it was manageable if I executed every step with absolute precision. I could not just drive down to the title office and make a scene. Bryce had likely anticipated that possibility. If I walked in yelling about a forgery without legally binding proof, they would simply claim I was experiencing a severe cognitive decline. They would use my outburst as evidence that I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs, playing the role of the tragic, embarrassed children trying to handle a sick parent. I needed a legal blockade. I needed something rigid, good, and undeniable that would freeze the funds the second they tried to move them. But my first priority was not the money. The money was secondary. My primary concern was the 15-year-old boy sitting in my kitchen. Micah was the crucial piece of this entire puzzle, and he was currently the most vulnerable. I could not take him with me. The places I needed to go, and the people I needed to see, required speed and discretion. More importantly, if Bryce and Delia realized their plan was failing, they might panic. Desperate people do unpredictable, violent things when cornered, and they had already proven they were willing to treat their own son like a prisoner. I needed to get Micah completely off the board. I needed to stash him somewhere totally secure. somewhere Bryce and Delia would never think to look before I went to war. I walked out of the office and back down the sunlit hallway. Micah was still sitting at the island, chewing slowly on a slice of apple. He looked up at me. His eyes were searching my face for any sign of what we were going to do next. I gave him a reassuring nod. I told him to grab his duffel bag. We were leaving the estate. The clock was ticking, and it was time to tear down the house of lies they had built. I told Micah to grab his green duffel bag and put his empty water glass in the sink. We needed to move, and we needed to do it without leaving a digital footprint. Bryce was exactly the kind of man who would install wireless security cameras on the exterior of the guest house, pointing toward my driveway, just to monitor my comings and goings. I knew the blind spots. I had lived on this property for 40 years. I guided my grandson out the side door of the kitchen, keeping us close to the tall privacy hedges that lined the eastern edge of the estate. The air outside was thick with the midday heat, but my blood felt like ice water. We moved silently across the grass. As we rounded the corner of the garage, I saw Silas. The young man was standing exactly where I had told him to wait, leaning against the rusty side panel of his old landscaping truck. He had a weed whacker resting at his feet, and he was wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty rag. When he saw me emerge from the shadow of the hedges, with a pale, trembling teenager trailing behind me, his eyes widened. I walked up to him and stopped a few feet away. I did not offer a comforting smile. I looked him straight in the eye and thanked him for calling me. I told him that what he had done this morning had saved my grandson from a very dark, very dangerous situation. Silas swallowed hard. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other and asked if he should call the police. He said it looked like a kidnapping. He was a smart kid, sharp enough to know when to speak and when to listen. I told him the police would absolutely be involved, but not right this second. I explained that if squad cars pulled into my driveway right now, the people responsible for locking Micah in that basement would be notified immediately. They would have time to destroy documents, move money, and cover their tracks. I told Silas I was dealing with corporate fraud mixed with child endangerment, and I needed exactly 4 hours of complete operational silence to spring a trap they could not escape. Silas nodded slowly, digesting the information. He did not press for more details. He simply asked what I needed him to do. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. Whenever I leave the house, I carry a substantial amount of emergency cash. It is an old habit from my days as a forensic auditor, back when I frequently traveled to rural counties where credit card machines were non-existent. I pulled out a thick leather money clip. I counted out $1,500 in crisp $100 bills. I held the money out to him. I told Silas that I needed to hire him for a highly specialized, off-the-books landscaping job. I told him the job required him to take the rest of the day off, drive his truck straight to his family home, and take my grandson with him. I knew Silas lived with his mother and 2 younger sisters in a quiet neighborhood across town. We had spoken about his family several times when I paid him his monthly wages. He was working hard to put himself through a local community college, and his mother worked night shifts as a nurse. I told him I needed Micah to sit on a comfortable couch, eat a hot meal, and be surrounded by normal, safe people. I told him he was not to let Micah use a phone, log into a computer, or contact anyone under any circumstances. If anyone came looking for Micah, Silas was to lock the doors and call 911 immediately. But until I came to pick him up, they were just 2 young men hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. Silas looked at the stack of cash in my hand. It was probably more than he made in a month of mowing lawns and trimming hedges in the blistering heat, but he did not reach for it right away. Instead, he looked past me, fixing his gaze on Micah. Micah was standing perfectly still, clutching his bag, his shoulders hunched inward, as if he were trying to make himself invisible. Silas saw the profound exhaustion and fear radiating from the boy. Silas reached out and took the money. He shoved it deep into the front pocket of his work jeans. He looked back at me and said, "You do not have to worry about a thing, sir. My mom just made a huge batch of baked ziti this morning. We will go eat, watch some baseball, and keep the doors locked tight. No one is getting near him." I felt a massive wave of relief wash over my chest. I turned to my grandson. I put both hands on his shoulders and looked him directly in the eyes. I told him that Silas was a good man and that he was going to be perfectly safe. I told Micah to eat something, try to get some sleep on their couch, and trust that I was handling the situation. I promised him that by the time the sun went down tonight, he would never have to be afraid of his parents ever again. Micah dropped his duffel bag on the grass and wrapped his arms around my waist. He hugged me with a desperate, crushing grip. He buried his face in my shoulder and thanked me. I held him tight, resting my chin against the top of his head, allowing myself exactly 5 seconds to feel the overwhelming love of a grandfather. Then the 5 seconds were up. The auditor took over again. I gently pushed him back, gave him a firm nod, and opened the passenger door of Silas's battered truck. Micah climbed inside and pulled the seatbelt across his chest. Silas threw his weed whacker into the bed of the truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The old motor roared to life, coughing a small cloud of dark exhaust into the hot summer air. I stepped back and watched as the truck pulled out of my sweeping driveway. I waited until the taillights disappeared around the bend at the end of the street. The heavy, oppressive silence of the empty estate settled around me once again. I was completely alone. My most valuable asset was now fully secured. The one piece of leverage Delia and Bryce thought they held over me was safely eating baked ziti in a living room 10 miles away. They had no idea that their hostage was gone. They had no idea that their perfect, impenetrable plan was already falling apart at the seams. I walked back toward my house, my boots crunching softly against the gravel path. I bypassed the main entrance and went straight to the garage. I unlocked the side door and stepped into the cool, dark space. My heavy-duty truck was parked inside, fully fueled and ready to go. I climbed into the driver's seat and put the keys in the ignition. I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was exactly 12:15 in the afternoon. I had 2 hours and 45 minutes until the real estate closing. I put the truck into gear and backed out of the garage. It was time to pay a visit to an old friend. It was time to summon the only man in this city who could freeze a multi-million-dollar transaction faster than I could. I pulled out onto the main road and pointed my truck toward the downtown district. The silent adjustment was in full effect. I steered my heavy truck onto the interstate, heading straight for the heart of the city. The midday traffic was dense, moving with a sluggish indifference that tested every ounce of my patience. I did not speed, and I did not weave erratically between lanes. Getting pulled over for a traffic violation would burn precious minutes I could not afford to lose. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands firmly on the steering wheel, letting the hum of the engine focus my mind. The digital clock on the dashboard flipped to 12:30. Time was bleeding away. I needed legal firepower, and I needed it immediately. My destination was a sleek glass building in the financial district. It housed the law firm of Roland. Roland and I go back over 30 years. He is a brilliant estate attorney, a man who navigates corporate law with the same ruthless precision I used to hunt down embezzled tax funds. We built a friendship on a mutual respect for order and a shared disdain for liars. When my wife passed away, Roland was the one who structured my estate. He drew up the very documents my daughter and her husband were currently trying to circumvent. I pulled into the underground parking garage and bypassed the visitor spots, slipping my truck into a reserved space. I walked briskly to the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The doors slid open to a quiet, elegant reception area. The receptionist recognized me immediately. She started to greet me, but I did not stop walking. I told her I needed to see Roland right now. She saw the look on my face and simply picked up her phone. I pushed open the heavy oak door to his private office without knocking. Roland was sitting at his massive desk, reviewing a thick stack of legal briefs. He looked up, surprised by the intrusion. He took off his reading glasses and studied my face. He knew instantly that something catastrophic had happened. I did not bother with pleasantries. I closed the door behind me, making sure it clicked shut. I walked over to his desk, pulled the forged real estate contract from my jacket pocket, and laid it flat on the polished mahogany surface. I told Roland we had less than 2.5 hours to stop a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction. I told him the signatures on the document were entirely forged by my own daughter and her bankrupt husband. Roland picked up the contract, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs. His expression hardened into a mask of pure professional hostility. He asked me where my grandson was. I told him Micah was completely secure and hidden away because Delia and Bryce had locked him inside a reinforced basement room to keep him quiet. Roland dropped the paper on the desk. He leaned back in his leather chair and let out a slow, measured breath. He has known Delia since she was a little girl. He knew Bryce was a flashy, arrogant fool. But realizing they were capable of caging their own child to facilitate a massive financial crime shifted the atmosphere in the room from a legal consultation to a war room. Roland stood up, walked over to his office door, and locked it. He rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt and told me to sit down. We moved over to his large computer monitor. Roland is not just a man of paper and ink. He understands the digital architecture of modern real estate transfers. He logged into a secure state property database and typed in my home address. We needed to find out exactly which title company was handling the escrow and where the closing was taking place. The forged contract Micah had found was a preliminary draft. It had the name of the commercial developer, but it did not list the specific escrow agent holding the funds. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He pulled up the county clerk records, searching for any pending notices of sale or recent title searches connected to my parcel of land. Nothing had been officially filed yet, which made perfect sense. Bryce and Delia were waiting for the ink to dry on the final closing documents before recording the deed transfer. They wanted the wire transfer to clear before anyone could raise a red flag. I leaned over his shoulder and told him to stop looking at my property records. I told him to look at the commercial developer listed on the contract instead. A massive corporate development group does not use random local title companies. They use highly specialized corporate escrow firms that can handle massive liquid transfers in a matter of hours. Roland nodded, recognizing the logic immediately. He cross-referenced the developer name with recent commercial acquisitions in the city. Within 10 minutes, he found a pattern. The developer exclusively used a high-end commercial title firm located just 3 blocks away from our current location. Roland pulled up the firm contact registry and found the name of their senior closing agent. He picked up his office phone and dialed the number. He did not introduce himself as my friend. He introduced himself as the senior partner of his law firm and the official legal representative of the estate in question. Roland asked the closing agent to confirm a scheduled 3 o'clock signing regarding my property. The agent hesitated, citing client confidentiality. Roland did not raise his voice, but his tone became razor-sharp. He informed the agent that the individuals sitting in her conference room later that afternoon were presenting forged legal documents. He warned her that if she facilitated the wire transfer, she and her firm would be named as co-conspirators in a massive federal fraud investigation. The agent broke immediately. She confirmed that a closing was indeed scheduled for 3 o'clock. She stated that Delia and Bryce had provided a certified power of attorney earlier that week, granting them full legal authority to liquidate the estate on my behalf, due to my supposedly failing cognitive health. They had presented fake medical evaluations to speed up the process. Roland hung up the phone. He looked at me and confirmed what we both already suspected. The trap was fully set on their end. They had layered lies upon lies to build a foolproof narrative. But now we knew exactly where they were going to be, and we knew exactly what fake documents they were relying on. We had the target in our sights. The trace was complete, and it was time to build a legal wall so thick they would shatter upon impact. Roland did not simply hang up the phone and leave the situation at a verbal warning. He demanded that the closing agent send a secure digital copy of the entire transaction file immediately. He told her that if she wanted to protect her professional license and avoid federal prison, she would email him the fraudulent power of attorney and the attached medical addenda right that very second. The agent was terrified enough by the mention of a federal fraud investigation to comply without any further hesitation. Less than 5 minutes later, a sharp notification chime echoed from the computer speakers. The encrypted file had arrived. Roland opened the document and projected it onto the large, high-definition screen mounted on his office wall. I stood up from the leather guest chair and walked closer to the glowing monitor. The room was perfectly silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning unit. As my eyes scanned the digital pages, the true magnitude of my daughter's betrayal unfolded before me in stark black and white text. It was one thing to hear about a forged signature on a real estate contract from a frightened 15-year-old boy. It was an entirely different experience to see the calculated legal assassination of my own identity projected on a massive screen. The first document in the packet was a durable power of attorney. It was meticulously drafted and formatted to look completely legitimate. It granted Bryce and Delia absolute and unconditional control over my physical property, my investment accounts, my healthcare directives, and my entire estate. The language was sweeping and absolute, leaving no room for my own agency. They had not just forged my name at the bottom of the page. They had acquired a fake notary public stamp, complete with a fraudulent state registration number. The document brazenly stated that I had willingly surrendered my autonomy in the presence of sworn witnesses. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction, designed to strip me of my rights and reduce me to a silent spectator in my own life. But the second document in the file was the one that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. It was a medical evaluation. The official-looking letterhead belonged to a private psychiatric clinic located 2 counties away. I had never been to that clinic in my entire life. I had never met the doctor, whose elaborate signature adorned the bottom of the page. Yet the evaluation detailed a tragic and incredibly rapid cognitive decline. The fake doctor claimed that I was suffering from severe, advanced dementia. The report stated that I was experiencing aggressive episodes, frequent memory lapses, and a complete inability to manage my own basic daily needs. It concluded that the immediate liquidation of my real estate assets was medically necessary to fund my long-term institutional care. I read the horrible words again. Advanced dementia, inability to manage basic needs, institutional care. This was not a hasty, desperate attempt to steal a little bit of money to cover a bad month of business logistics. This was a premeditated assassination of my character and my freedom. Delia and Bryce had sat down together over the course of weeks or even months to carefully construct a narrative that painted me as a helpless, senile burden. They had typed out vicious lies about my mind failing. They had fabricated tragic medical symptoms. They had built a comprehensive paper trail designed to justify taking everything I had ever worked for and locking me away in a state-run facility just so they could enjoy the spoils of my labor. I thought about my daughter. I thought about the countless times I had held her when she was a little girl, teaching her how to ride a bicycle, and sitting at the kitchen table, helping her with her math homework. I had spent my entire adult life trying to provide a rock-solid foundation for her to stand on. And now she had used that very same foundation to build a trapdoor directly beneath my feet. The level of malice required to look a parent in the eye, smile at them over the dinner table, and secretly draft legal documents declaring them mentally dead was staggering. It required a complete and total absence of human empathy. Roland stood quietly beside me, watching the expressions cross my face. He is a man who deals with ugly family disputes and bitter inheritance battles every single day, but even he looked slightly pale, reading the fabricated medical report. He turned to me and pointed out that this level of document fraud required serious, sustained coordination. Bryce could not have executed this alone. Delia had to be a fully willing and highly active participant. She had to provide my comprehensive medical history, my social security number, and my intimate personal details to make the fake psychological evaluation look credible to the escrow company. She had willingly handed over the keys to my identity so her husband could pay off his dangerous private lenders. Roland explained the precise legal trap they had blindly stepped into by creating these specific documents. By submitting these forged files across state lines to a commercial developer and utilizing digital wire services to facilitate the upcoming transaction, they had dramatically elevated their crime. This was no longer just a simple case of domestic theft or local forgery. This was federal wire fraud. It was a multi-million-dollar felony conspiracy. The forged notary stamp alone carried a mandatory state prison sentence. By trying to build an airtight narrative to protect themselves, they had accidentally built an airtight criminal case against themselves. I stepped away from the glowing monitor and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The initial shock of the betrayal was completely gone, replaced by a sharp, crystal-clear resolve. I felt absolutely no hesitation anymore. Any lingering paternal instinct to protect my daughter from the harsh consequences of her actions had evaporated the exact second I read the words "advanced dementia" on that fraudulent medical report. She had made her choice. She had decided I was no longer a father, but a disposable financial asset. I turned back to face Roland. The heavy brass clock on his desk read 1:15 in the afternoon. The closing appointment was less than 2 hours away. Bryce and Delia were likely getting dressed in their most expensive designer clothes right now, preparing to walk into that high-end title office and play the roles of the tragic, burdened children making a tough decision for their sick father. They thought they had outsmarted everyone. They thought my mind was just as weak and fragile as the fake doctor claimed. I told Roland to print every single page of that digital file. I told him we were going to take their meticulously crafted legal trap and reverse the mechanism entirely. We were going to let them walk into that closing room. We were going to let them smile and shake hands with the corporate developers. We were going to let them believe they had won the lottery. And then we were going to bring the entire concrete structure crashing down directly on their heads. Roland nodded without saying a word. He turned to his heavy-duty office printer, and the machine whirred to life, spitting out the evidence of their ultimate betrayal, page by page. The very paper trail they had created to destroy my life was now the exact weapon I would use to dismantle theirs. The printer in the corner of the office stopped spitting out the fraudulent documents. I walked over and gathered the warm papers in my hands. Bryce and Delia thought I was just a naive, retired civil engineer. They thought my entire professional life had been spent calculating the load-bearing capacity of concrete and steel. They thought I was a man who only understood physical structures and physical labor. What my daughter and her husband conveniently chose to ignore was the second half of my career. For 20 years, I did not work with concrete or blueprints. I worked with numbers. I was a senior forensic auditor for the State Financial Crimes Division. My specific job was tracking down white-collar criminals who tried to hide stolen money in complex webs of offshore accounts and shell companies. I spent 2 decades working in a windowless government building, sorting through mountains of bank statements, hidden ledgers, and encrypted hard drives. My specialty was asset recovery and financial containment. When a corrupt politician or a fraudulent contractor tried to move stolen public funds, I was the man the state sent to follow the money. I learned how desperate people think. I learned how they panic. I learned the exact mistakes they make when they believe they are the smartest people in the room. Bryce was a textbook case. He possessed the arrogant delusion of a classic fraudster. He truly believed his leased cars and fake confidence made him untouchable. He assumed that because I spent my days quietly reading the newspaper in a local diner, I had lost my edge. Delia knew better. She grew up watching me work late into the night, reviewing audit files, and preparing testimonies for state prosecutors. She used to sit at the kitchen table while I explained how financial criminals always leave a digital footprint. She knew my capabilities perfectly well, but the blinding desperation of a bankrupt lifestyle had completely erased her common sense. She convinced herself I was just a tired old man with fading memories. She mistook my quiet retirement for weakness. I walked around the large mahogany desk and asked Roland to step aside. He rolled his leather chair out of the way, without saying a word. I sat down and placed my hands on his keyboard. My fingers remembered the familiar rhythm of financial tracking. I did not need to guess how Bryce and Delia planned to move the money. I knew the exact sequence of banking protocols they would attempt to use. When a commercial real estate developer purchases a property for millions of dollars, they do not hand over a physical check. They initiate a high-priority federal wire transfer. That money lands in a temporary escrow account. Once the forged documents were signed, the title company would release those funds directly into an account controlled by Bryce. Bryce would then immediately wire that cash to the aggressive private lenders he owed, effectively laundering the stolen money through legitimate debt repayment. But a wire transfer is not magic. It is a digital signal sent through a clearinghouse, and as an experienced auditor, I know every single tripwire necessary to freeze that signal mid-flight. I opened a secure portal to my primary banking institution. I bypassed the standard customer service interface and accessed the high net worth fraud division. I typed out a sequence of administrative commands. I flagged every single account linked to my name, my social security number, and my estate. I did not just place a temporary hold on the accounts. A temporary hold is something a customer service representative can lift over the phone, if a smooth-talking fraudster knows the right answers to security questions. I placed a catastrophic fraud lock on everything. This specific protocol required my physical presence, a biometric verification, and a sworn affidavit in front of a bank manager to remove. I instructed Roland to pull up the exact routing numbers for the title company that the developer was using. I needed to ensure that our financial blockade specifically targeted that incoming escrow wire. I logged into the federal banking gateway using my legacy credentials, which were still active for advisory purposes. I initiated a targeted quarantine on the specific routing sequence listed on the forged documents. When the title company attempted to disperse the funds into the accounts authorized by Bryce, the banking network would accept the initial handshake and then instantly quarantine the entire massive sum. The money would hang suspended in a digital void. The developer would not get the deed. Bryce would not get his payout. The private lenders would not get their debts settled. Roland stood silently beside the desk, watching me work. He leaned against the wall with a look of profound respect. He told me it was terrifying to watch me operate when I was angry. I did not look up from the monitor. I told him I was not angry at all. Anger is an unpredictable emotion that makes people sloppy. Anger is the reason Bryce locked his own teenage son in a dark basement. Anger clouds judgment and leaves obvious evidence behind. I was completely cold. I clicked the mouse. I confirmed the final security prompts. I watched the status bars turn from active to restricted. The financial drawbridge was pulled up. I finished the final security protocol and hit the return key. The screen flashed a bright green confirmation message. The accounts were permanently locked. I turned away from the computer and looked at Roland. The trap was perfectly primed. Bryce and Delia were about to walk into the closing office, completely unaware that the vault they were trying to rob had just been filled with solid concrete. They were walking into a financial dead end, and they were dragging their entire fake reality down with them. I pushed my chair back from the desk and turned the operation over to Roland. The digital wall was in place, but we needed a physical legal barricade to completely paralyze the transaction. Roland moved to his own workstation and began drafting an emergency injunction. He did not use boilerplate templates. He typed with furious, relentless speed, citing specific state statutes regarding elder fraud, forged signatures on warranty deeds, and the exploitation of a fabricated power of attorney. He attached the digital files we had received from the title company, labeling them as explicit evidence of a criminal conspiracy in progress. Roland explained that an injunction of this magnitude required a judge's immediate signature. Fortunately, after 30 years of practicing state law in this city, Roland had the direct phone numbers of several circuit court judges. He picked up his receiver and made a brief, highly technical phone call to a judge who specialized in commercial real estate fraud. He explained the severe, time-sensitive nature of the situation. He detailed how a pair of desperate individuals were currently sitting in a downtown office, attempting to liquidate an entire estate using fraudulent medical evaluations. The judge did not hesitate. Within 20 minutes, a digitally signed and heavily watermarked court order materialized in Roland's inbox. Roland printed the injunction and slid the crisp, warm pages across the mahogany desk toward me. He told me that this piece of paper was a tactical weapon. Even if a banking error somehow allowed the developer's wire transfer to bypass my quarantine, this injunction legally prohibited the county clerk from recording the deed. The property could not change hands. The commercial developer would instantly realize the title was clouded. The escrow company would panic, and the entire multi-million-dollar deal would shatter into a million useless pieces. Bryce and Delia were officially selling a ghost. Roland then asked me the logical next question. He asked if he should contact the credit card companies and immediately cancel the secondary lines of credit I had foolishly allowed my daughter and her husband to use over the years. He assumed I wanted to stop the financial bleeding completely. I looked at him and shook my head. I told him to leave the credit cards entirely active. I did not want a single limit lowered or a single account frozen. Roland looked confused for a fraction of a second before the realization dawned on his face. I explained that cutting off their credit cards right now would alert them that something was wrong. If their cards started declining at a restaurant or a store, Bryce would instantly log into his banking apps. He would see the frozen accounts. He would panic, and he would realize the closing had failed before I was ready to look him in the eye. I wanted them to feel absolutely comfortable. I wanted them to feel victorious. Furthermore, active credit cards are the best tracking devices ever invented. Every time they swiped that plastic, my phone would receive a real-time notification, giving me their exact geographic location. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and opened the banking application. I navigated to the transaction alert page and set the phone on the desk between us. The brass clock in the office chimed 3 times. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The closing appointment had officially begun. Bryce and Delia were sitting in a conference room just a few blocks away, smiling, signing fake documents, and shaking hands with corporate lawyers. Roland and I sat in silence, watching the blank screen of my phone. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 3:15, 3:30, 3:45. I pictured my daughter holding a fancy pen, smiling a charming, deceitful smile as she handed over the home where she grew up. I pictured Bryce puffing out his chest, believing he had finally secured the massive payout needed to save his miserable, bankrupt life. At exactly 4:12 in the afternoon, the screen of my phone lit up. A notification banner slid across the glass. It was a charge for $450 at an upscale champagne lounge located right down the street from the title company. I stared at the notification. They had walked out of the closing office, believing the money was currently moving through the banking system. They believed they were rich. Their immediate response was to walk down the block and buy incredibly expensive alcohol to celebrate their brilliant deception. They were toasting to their success, completely ignoring the fact that they had locked their own 15-year-old son in a dark, suffocating basement to achieve it. The sheer, unadulterated selfishness of that champagne purchase solidified every single decision I had made today. 20 minutes later, a second notification illuminated the screen. This time, it was a charge for over $2,000 at a high-end designer boutique just around the corner from the lounge. Delia was shopping. She was treating herself to a victory prize using the credit line I paid for. She was trying on clothes, looking in the mirror, and feeling entirely pleased with the woman staring back at her. The profound disconnect between her actions and reality was almost fascinating to witness. I picked up the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The digital breadcrumbs were telling a very clear story. They were relaxed. They were completely off their guard. They were dragging out their afternoon in the city, enjoying the spoils of a war they did not know they had already lost. They would not head back to the suburban estate for at least another hour or two. I gathered the printed injunction documents and folded them neatly, placing them inside my jacket, right next to the forged contract Micah had given me. I looked at Roland and thanked him for his speed and his absolute precision. He stood up, shook my hand, and told me he had already spoken with his contacts at the local police department. The authorities were fully briefed on the forgery, the financial fraud, and the child endangerment. They were simply waiting for my signal to move in. I walked out of the law office and took the elevator down to the parking garage. The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the city streets as I drove my truck out into the traffic. I pointed the vehicle towards the suburbs. The trap was completely set. The exits were sealed. I needed to get back to the estate, sit in the dark dining room, and wait for them to come home. I sat perfectly still in the shadows of my own dining room. The heavy oak table stretched out in front of me, bare except for the folded legal documents resting under my right hand. The house was completely silent. I had turned off every light on the ground floor. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, a steady, rhythmic sound that kept me grounded. Through the large front windows, I watched the afternoon sun slowly dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn. The brass clock in the hallway chimed 6 times. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. A few minutes later, the unmistakable crunch of gravel echoed from the driveway. The headlights of Bryce's leased luxury sedan swept across the living room walls, briefly cutting through the darkness before the engine was cut off. I did not move a single muscle. I sat straight in my chair, regulating my breathing, waiting for the performance to begin. The heavy car doors slammed shut. Even through the thick glass of the windows, I could hear their laughter. It was a loud, carefree sound, the kind of laughter that comes from people who believe they have just won the lottery. I listened to their footsteps approaching the front porch. Keys jingled against the deadbolt. The front door swung open, and a wash of warm evening air spilled into the foyer, bringing their voices clearly into the house. Bryce was the first to speak. He was practically shouting, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. He told Delia that he could not believe how incredibly simple the entire process had been. He boasted about the corporate lawyers sitting around that massive conference table, completely oblivious to the forgery sitting right under their noses. Delia laughed in agreement. Her voice, the voice of the daughter I had raised and protected, sounded light and musical. She told her husband that he was a genius, that his performance in the title office had been absolutely flawless. They walked past the darkened dining room without looking inside. Their focus was entirely on the kitchen. I listened as they dropped heavy shopping bags onto the granite island. The unmistakable clinking of glass followed. Bryce had brought champagne. He was practically vibrating with excitement as he peeled the foil off the bottle. He popped the cork, allowing it to hit the ceiling and bounce across the tile floor. I could hear the sparkling wine pouring into crystal glasses. Delia sighed deeply, a sound of profound, victorious relief. She told Bryce that she could finally breathe again. She said the crushing weight of their debt was officially gone, erased the moment those papers were notarized. She talked about the aggressive private lenders who had been calling her phone all week. She said she could not wait to see the look on their faces when a massive wire transfer cleared their accounts by Monday morning. She truly believed the money was currently floating through the banking system, destined for their pockets. She believed my life savings were about to wash away her mistakes. Bryce raised his glass and offered a toast. I sat in the darkness, listening to my son-in-law celebrate the theft of my estate. He toasted to their fresh start. He toasted to the commercial developers who were foolish enough to expedite the funding. And then, he toasted to me. He actually laughed and told Delia that the old man would not even realize he had lost his house until the bulldozers showed up on the front lawn. Delia giggled, a sound that made my chest tighten with a cold, absolute resolve. She said I was too caught up in my diner routines and newspaper puzzles to notice a missing deed. She justified their crime by claiming I was getting too old to manage such a large property anyway. She said they were practically doing me a favor. They drank their champagne, enjoying the cool air of the kitchen, surrounded by the expensive designer clothes Delia had purchased just hours ago with my stolen money. The sheer entitlement of their celebration was fascinating to observe. They had committed federal wire fraud, forged medical documents, and stolen a family estate. Yet they were standing in my kitchen, acting like they had just closed a brilliant, legitimate business deal. They felt no remorse. They felt no guilt. They only felt the intoxicating rush of getting away with it. Then the conversation shifted. The celebratory tone dropped, replaced by a cold, practical annoyance. Bryce set his glass down on the granite counter and told Delia they needed to deal with the kid before I came back from my errands. My blood ran completely cold. They were talking about Micah. They had been drinking champagne and shopping for clothes while their own 15-year-old son was supposedly locked in a pitch-black, windowless storage room beneath their feet. Delia agreed, her voice losing its musical quality. She complained that Micah had become a massive liability. She said he was entirely too smart for his own good, always snooping around where he did not belong. She told Bryce they needed to go down to the basement right now and establish ground rules. She suggested they bribe him first, promising to buy him a new car when he turned 16 with their new wealth, as long as he kept his mouth shut about the forged signature. Bryce immediately rejected the idea of a bribe. He said Micah needed a much firmer hand. Bryce told my daughter that if Micah tried to say a single word about the laptop or the real estate documents, they would simply extend his punishment. Bryce said he would keep the boy locked in that room all weekend if he had to. He claimed that a few days of isolation would break the kid's stubborn streak and force him to understand who was really in charge. He spoke about his son the way a warden speaks about a disobedient prisoner. And Delia, the mother of that child, agreed with him. She said they could not afford any mistakes right now. She said if Micah ruined this payout, they would be utterly destroyed. She was willing to sacrifice her son's mental and physical well-being to protect the stolen money. She was willing to leave him in the dark, terrified and alone, just to secure her own comfort. I listened to the clinking of their glasses as they finished their champagne. I heard Bryce tell Delia to grab a fresh bottle of water from the refrigerator to take down to the basement, mentioning that the boy was probably thirsty by now. They were preparing to walk down the hallway, unlock the reinforced door, and terrorize a child who was not even there. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that their hostage had been safely extracted hours ago. They were completely unaware that the money they were celebrating had been permanently frozen in a digital vault. They thought they were the masters of this house. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect crime. They believed the old man was still out running pointless errands. They had absolutely no idea that I was sitting less than 20 feet away from them, waiting in the shadows, holding the very documents that would send them both to a federal penitentiary. I heard their footsteps moving away from the kitchen island. They were walking toward the hallway that led to the basement stairs, passing directly in front of the open archway of the dining room. The time for listening was over. The false victory had run its course. It was time to turn on the lights. I sat in the dark dining room, listening to the heavy thud of Bryce's leather shoes and the sharp click of Delia's heels on the hardwood floor. They were moving down the main hallway, completely relaxed, heading straight toward the basement door. To reach that door, they had to pass directly through the open archway of the dining room. I did not breathe. I simply waited. As they crossed the threshold, Delia reached out and flicked the wall switch. The crystal chandelier above my head flared to life, bathing the room in bright, warm light. I was sitting at the head of the long oak table, with my hands folded neatly in front of me. I did not move. I just looked up at them. The physical reaction was instantaneous and incredibly satisfying to witness. Bryce let out a sharp gasp and stumbled backward, bumping hard into the doorframe. The plastic bottle of water he was carrying for his captive son slipped from his fingers and hit the floor, bouncing away under a hallway console table. Delia froze completely still. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly white. Her eyes went wide, staring at me as if she had just seen a ghost materialize in her own home. For a span of 10 seconds, nobody said a single word. The silence was heavy and suffocating. They were caught entirely off guard, expecting to find an empty house while I was supposed to be miles away running errands. They were paralyzed by the sudden collapse of their perfect timeline. I did not yell. I did not jump up from my chair or demand an explanation. When you want to watch a liar trap themselves, you simply give them enough rope to hang themselves. I offered a warm, gentle smile. I leaned back in my chair and asked them how the corporate retreat was going. I kept my voice completely casual, as if asking about the weather. I asked why they were back at the estate so early on a Saturday evening. I told them I thought the logistics seminar they mentioned was supposed to last until Sunday afternoon. Bryce was completely incapable of speaking. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was sweating, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the hallway leading to the basement. He was terrified that I might have heard the crying. But Delia is a different kind of animal. The initial shock wore off in a matter of seconds. I watched my daughter physically compose herself. She smoothed the front of her expensive new blouse, forced a bright smile onto her face, and stepped fully into the dining room. She lied to me with a fluidity that was genuinely terrifying. She walked over to the table and told me that the retreat had been a massive disappointment. She said the keynote speaker was incredibly boring and that the team-building exercises were a total waste of time. She claimed that Bryce decided to cut the trip short because his time was too valuable to waste on poorly organized seminars. She did not stumble over a single word. She looked me directly in the eyes and fabricated an entire weekend itinerary without a single flicker of guilt. She described the terrible hotel food, the crowded conference rooms, and the terrible traffic they hit on the drive back to the suburbs. She was creating an alternate reality right in front of my face, standing less than 30 feet away from the room where she believed her child was locked in the dark. It was a masterclass in deception. I nodded along, pretending to buy every single word. I told her that it was a shame the company wasted their time, but that I was glad they were home safe. Bryce finally managed to find his voice. He stepped into the dining room, standing close to Delia, as if seeking physical protection from the lie she was building. He forced a strained laugh and nodded his head rapidly. He told me that Delia was absolutely right. He said the logistics industry was moving too fast for outdated corporate retreats, and he needed to be back at his desk to handle important international accounts. He was sweating profusely. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and tried to sound confident. He asked me how my Saturday was going. He asked if I had enjoyed my morning coffee at the diner and what errands I had been running all afternoon. I told him my day had been incredibly productive. I said I had spent the afternoon catching up with an old friend from my working days. I mentioned that it is amazing how much you can accomplish when you focus on the details. I was speaking in truths, but they were truths completely disguised as small talk. I looked at the shopping bags Delia had dropped on the floor near the kitchen archway. I asked them if they had done some shopping on the way back from the terrible corporate retreat. I asked if they had found some good deals in the city. Delia did not even hesitate. She glanced at the bags filled with luxury clothing she had purchased using my stolen credit line. She smiled sweetly and told me that since the retreat was a bust, they decided to stop at a local outlet mall to buy a few things for Micah. She actually used her son as an alibi. She told me she bought him some new shirts and shoes for when he returned from his coding camp. She said she missed him already and wanted to have a surprise waiting for him. The sheer audacity of using the boy she was currently torturing as an excuse to cover up her stolen luxury goods was sickening. I nodded slowly, maintaining the facade of the naive, grateful grandfather. I told her that was incredibly thoughtful. I said, "Micah is a good boy, and he deserves to be rewarded for his hard work." I watched them both relax. I saw the tension drain from their shoulders. They exchanged a very quick, subtle look of relief. They genuinely believed they had successfully navigated the ambush. They thought the old man had bought the lie, hook, line, and sinker. They believed they were completely safe, and that the millions of dollars from the fraudulent real estate closing were still securely on their way to their accounts. Bryce even walked over to the dining room table and leaned against one of the heavy oak chairs. He crossed his arms over his chest, trying to project authority. He told me they were going to head over to the guest house to unpack and relax for the evening. He said they were exhausted from the drive and just wanted to order some food and go to sleep. He was trying to politely dismiss me from their presence so they could finally go down to the basement and interrogate their hostage. He was trying to clear the board, but I was not going anywhere. The small talk was officially over. I moved my right hand slowly across the polished oak table, resting my fingertips on the folded papers I had brought from the law office. It was time to end the charade. I moved my right hand slowly across the polished oak table. I pushed the folded stack of heavy white paper toward the center of the room. The papers made a soft sliding sound against the wood. I looked at Bryce and told him that before he and Delia went back to the guest house to relax, I had a few documents I needed them to review. I said they looked like legal notices, and I was having trouble understanding the fine print. Bryce rolled his eyes. He let out a loud, exasperated sigh, acting like a busy executive who simply did not have time to deal with an old man and his confusing mail. Bryce walked over to the table with heavy, arrogant steps. He reached out and picked up the stack of papers with one hand. Delia stayed near the kitchen archway, holding her designer shopping bags with a look of mild irritation on her face. Bryce unfolded the pages carelessly. I watched his eyes focus on the top sheet. It was the emergency court injunction Roland had secured from the circuit judge just a few hours prior. The document prominently displayed the state seal, the official watermarks, and the bold black text explicitly forbidding the transfer of the estate deed. I watched the exact moment Bryce stopped breathing. His eyes darted back and forth across the page, frantically scanning the complex legal terminology. He was reading the specific clauses, detailing elder fraud, forged signatures, and the immediate invalidation of the fraudulent power of attorney. The smug, confident posture he had maintained just moments ago completely collapsed. His shoulders slumped, and his hands began to shake so violently that the thick paper rattled in his grip. He tried to speak, but his throat seized up completely. He just stared at the injunction, as if it were a venomous snake coiled in his palms. Delia noticed the sudden physical change in her husband. The fake, bright smile dropped from her face instantly. She let her expensive shopping bags fall to the floor and quickly walked over to the dining room table. She asked Bryce what was wrong, her voice pitching upward in panic. She snatched the papers out of his trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the first page and she let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She looked at me, her face twisted in absolute horror and confusion. I did not say a single word. I just sat perfectly still and watched their house of cards disintegrate into dust. Delia flipped with shaking fingers to the second page of the packet. It was not a legal document. It was a printed snapshot of my primary banking portal. It showed the High Net Worth Fraud Division interface. It displayed the targeted quarantine protocol I had initiated that afternoon. The document explicitly listed the routing numbers belonging to their corporate escrow firm. Right next to those routing numbers, in bright, bold text, was the catastrophic fraud lock status. The money from the commercial developer had hit the digital wall and bounced. The realization hit my daughter like a speeding freight train. She dropped the papers onto the oak table and stumbled backward. She put her hands over her mouth, shaking her head back and forth in rapid, frantic denial. The millions of dollars they thought they had secured were entirely unreachable. The massive wire transfer that was supposed to wash away their crippling debt, pay off their dangerous private lenders, and fund their luxurious new lifestyle was completely gone. They had sold their souls, committed federal felonies, and tortured their own child for absolutely nothing. The payout had been permanently neutralized. I broke the silence in the room. I kept my voice incredibly low and calm, making sure every single syllable carried the weight of absolute authority. I told them that the commercial developer would not be getting the deed to my property today or any other day. I told them that the escrow company had already been formally notified of a federal wire fraud investigation. I explained that the banking network had flagged the incoming transfer as criminal proceeds and that the money was currently quarantined by the State Financial Crimes Division. I watched them process the fact that their perfect plan had failed completely. Bryce looked like a man who was about to physically collapse. He grabbed the edge of the dining table to keep his balance. His face was covered in a cold, panicked sweat. He asked me how I knew about the transaction. He demanded to know how an old, retired engineer could possibly hack into a high-security commercial escrow account and freeze a massive digital transfer in a matter of hours. He was desperately clinging to the arrogant delusion that I was just a naive, helpless old man. I decided it was time to educate my son-in-law. I stood up slowly from the head of the table, smoothing the front of my jacket. I told Bryce that he was right about my engineering background, but he had intentionally ignored the second half of my career. I explained that for 20 years, I was a senior forensic auditor for the state. I told him my entire job consisted of hunting down arrogant, desperate financial criminals who thought they could outsmart the system using forged documents and fake accounts. I told him he was the sloppiest amateur fraudster I had ever encountered in my entire professional life. The revelation struck Bryce like a physical blow. He realized he had not just tried to rob an old man. He had tried to rob a financial specialist who spent decades putting people exactly like him into federal prison. The sheer stupidity of his actions finally registered in his panicked mind. He had left a massive digital paper trail leading directly to his own doorstep, and he had invited an expert to follow it. Delia began to cry. It was not a quiet, subtle cry. It was a loud, ugly sob of pure, unfiltered desperation. She looked at the emergency injunction resting on the table, and then looked at me. She asked me what I had done. She accused me of ruining their lives. She said the private lenders were going to come looking for Bryce, and that they were going to lose absolutely everything. The complete lack of self-awareness was staggering. She was standing in the home she had tried to steal, complaining that I had ruined her life by stopping her from committing a felony. She was entirely blind to the destruction she had caused. I did not offer her an ounce of sympathy. I looked at my daughter and told her that her financial ruin was entirely her own creation. I told her that she had built a life on lies, and now the bill had finally come due. The celebratory champagne they had just finished drinking was the last taste of luxury they would ever experience. Their false victory was officially over, and the real dissection of their crimes had just begun. Bryce realized his pathetic attempts to play the victim were not working. The panic sweating out of his pores suddenly curdled into something much uglier. I watched his survival instinct take over. When a cornered animal realizes it cannot run, it turns and bares its teeth. Bryce straightened his posture and puffed out his chest, trying to use his height and physical size to intimidate me. The polite, respectful son-in-law routine evaporated completely. He took a heavy step toward the dining room table and slammed his hand down on the oak surface. He raised his voice, letting a harsh, aggressive tone echo through the house. He told me I was completely out of my mind. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and said I was suffering from a severe cognitive episode. He decided to lean entirely into the fraudulent medical narrative he had paid to create. He shouted that I was a sick, confused old man who had simply forgotten that I signed the power of attorney. He claimed the bank lock and the court injunction were the erratic actions of a mind ravaged by dementia. Delia immediately caught on to his strategy. She wiped her tears and changed her posture, shifting from a desperate thief to a deeply concerned and burdened daughter. She stepped up beside Bryce and looked at me with an expression of exaggerated pity. She told me to sit down and calm my nerves. She spoke to me in that slow, patronizing voice people use when talking to a toddler. She said I was confused about the dates and the paperwork. She insisted they were only trying to consolidate my assets to pay for the intensive neurological care I so desperately needed. She told me I was losing my grip on reality, and that they were simply trying to protect me from destroying my own legacy. I sat perfectly still and let them build their ridiculous fantasy. I have sat across the interrogation table from dozens of corporate embezzlers and corrupt officials. When confronted with undeniable proof of their crimes, every single one of them resorts to gaslighting. They try to convince the auditor that the numbers are wrong, that the documents are misunderstood, or that the investigator is simply too incompetent to grasp the bigger picture. Bryce and Delia were following the exact psychological script of a typical fraudster. I let them talk because every word they spoke only highlighted the absolute depths of their moral bankruptcy. Bryce mistook my silence for hesitation. He thought his aggressive posturing was actually working. He leaned over the table, getting closer to my face. He told me that if I tried to take this absurd conspiracy theory to the authorities, I would be the one ending up in a state facility. He said the police would look at a successful young couple and then look at an aging retired man who was clearly suffering from paranoid delusions. He smiled a nasty, cruel little smile. He told me I had absolutely no proof that could stand up against their carefully prepared medical evaluations. He truly believed his forged documents were an impenetrable shield. Then Bryce decided to play what he believed was his ultimate trump card. He shifted his weight, leaned back, and crossed his arms over his chest. He looked down at me with an expression of supreme, arrogant confidence. He told me that even if I wanted to fight them, I could not afford to burn bridges, because I needed them right now. He brought up my grandson. Bryce let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and claimed they had received a very troubling phone call earlier that afternoon. He lied to my face, without a single ounce of hesitation. He told me that Micah was acting out at his summer coding camp. He spun a detailed, fabricated story about how Micah had gotten into a serious altercation with another student and was currently facing expulsion from the university program. Bryce said the camp directors were threatening to involve local law enforcement due to property damage. He shook his head and said dealing with a troubled, out-of-control teenager was incredibly stressful. He looked at me and stated that a sick, fragile old man could not possibly handle a juvenile delinquent. He used his own son as a piece of emotional leverage, implying that if I caused problems with the real estate transfer, they would simply abandon Micah to the legal system. He was holding his own child hostage in a metaphorical sense, completely unaware that his literal hostage situation had already been dismantled. The sheer audacity of his lie was almost breathtaking. He was standing in my dining room, trying to extort me, using the fabricated misery of the very boy he had locked in a windowless basement just 20 feet below our shoes. He was willing to paint his brilliant, innocent son as a violent delinquent just to regain control of the conversation. I felt a cold, absolute disgust settle deep into my bones. The time for observation was completely over. The time for letting them spin their web of deceit had officially expired. I stood up slowly from my chair at the head of the table. I did not rush. I did not raise my hands or clench my fists. I simply stood to my full height, smoothing the front of my jacket. I looked past Delia and focused my eyes entirely on Bryce. I stripped every ounce of emotion from my voice. I spoke with the flat, unyielding tone of a judge delivering a final sentence. I told Bryce to stop talking. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The air in the dining room grew thick and heavy. Bryce opened his mouth to argue, but the look on my face forced the words back down his throat. His arrogant smile faltered. I kept my voice low and steady, ensuring every single word landed with devastating precision. I told him that Micah is not at a summer coding camp. I watched the blood drain entirely out of Bryce's face, leaving him a sickly grayish white. I told him that Micah is not facing expulsion, and he is not in trouble with any camp directors. I took a slow step around the table, moving closer to where they stood, frozen in shock. I told him that Micah is currently sitting in a safe, secure location, miles away from this estate, eating a hot meal and watching a baseball game. I told him that I broke the hinges off the reinforced basement door this morning while they were in the city, practicing my signature. Delia let out a choked, suffocating gasp. She stumbled backward, her knees hitting the edge of a dining chair. She raised her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked as though she might physically collapse. She knew the game was completely over. Bryce looked like a man who had just stepped off the edge of a skyscraper. He was completely paralyzed. His eyes darted toward the hallway leading to the basement stairs, confirming his absolute worst fear. I stepped right up to the edge of the table, closing the distance between us. I did not blink. I stared straight into his panicked, terrified eyes and delivered the final, absolute checkmate. I told Bryce that his son is entirely safe, and I told him that his son has already given his statement to the authorities. The silence that followed was the sound of a complete and total destruction. They had nothing left. No money, no leverage, no lies, and no son. The trap had fully snapped shut. The statement hung in the air, like a physical weight pressing down on the room. The knowledge that Micah had already given his statement completely shattered the fragile illusion Bryce had been clinging to. I watched the last remaining drops of blood drain from his face. The broad, arrogant shoulders that he had puffed out just moments before caved inward. His legs seemed to lose all structural integrity. He stumbled backward and fell heavily into one of the oak dining chairs. He did not look like a successful logistics manager anymore. He looked exactly like what he truly was, which was a terrified, bankrupt fraudster who had just realized he was going to spend the best years of his life in a federal penitentiary. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating, as the reality of his situation crushed his spirit. Bryce stared at the polished wood of the dining table, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving, as his mind frantically searched for an exit that simply did not exist. The realization that the authorities were already involved and that his own son had spoken to them completely paralyzed him. There was no more gaslighting to be done. There were no more fake medical documents that could save him. He was trapped. But while Bryce shut down completely, Delia shifted into a terrifying mode of absolute self-preservation. I watched my daughter evaluate the situation with the cold, calculating speed of a trapped animal. She looked at her husband, slouched in the chair, completely defeated and broken. Then she looked at me, standing tall and unmoving at the head of the table. She made a calculation in a fraction of a second. She realized that Bryce was a sinking ship, and she decided to cut the anchor immediately. Delia took a sudden, dramatic step away from Bryce, physically distancing herself from the man she had conspired with for months. She brought her trembling hands up to her face and let out a loud, agonizing sob. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, but they were not tears of remorse for what she had done to her father or her son. They were tears of pure, selfish terror. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, and her voice pitched upward into a frantic, desperate whine. She told me that I had to believe her. She said that none of this was her fault. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Bryce, who was still staring blankly at the table. She told me that Bryce had forced her into everything. She claimed his business debts had spiraled completely out of control, and that dangerous people were threatening their safety. She said Bryce became a completely different person, desperate and aggressive, and that she was absolutely terrified of what he might do. I stood perfectly still and listened to my daughter weave an entirely new tapestry of lies to save her own skin. She said the forged signature on the real estate contract was entirely his idea. She claimed she begged him not to do it, that she cried and pleaded with him to just ask me for a loan instead. She told me he had found the corrupt public notary on his own and orchestrated the entire fake medical evaluation without her consent. She was painting herself as a helpless victim of a tyrannical husband, completely ignoring the fact that I had just watched her gleefully celebrate the theft with a glass of expensive champagne. Then, she addressed the most unforgivable crime of all. She brought up Micah. Her voice cracked as she spoke about her own child. She told me that locking him in the basement was entirely Bryce's doing. She swore to me that she had tried to stop him when he dragged Micah across the lawn. She claimed she was weeping in the hallway when the heavy reinforced door was shut and locked. She said she only went along with the lie about the coding camp because Bryce threatened to hurt her if she told me the truth. She spun a pathetic narrative about how she planned to sneak down and unlock the door as soon as the real estate closing was finished. She wanted me to believe she was a captive in her own home. The sheer velocity of her betrayal was staggering. She was offering up her husband to the wolves without a single ounce of hesitation, throwing him completely under the bus to avoid a prison sentence. Bryce finally reacted to the vicious accusations being hurled at him. His head snapped up, and he stared at his wife with an expression of absolute disbelief. The shock of my ambush had paralyzed him, but Delia's betrayal brought him back to life with a jolt of panicked fury. Bryce stood up from the chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He shouted at Delia, asking her how she could possibly stand there and lie like that. He told her that finding the commercial developer was her idea. He reminded her that she was the one who provided all my personal medical history to fabricate the psychiatric evaluation. He pointed at the shopping bags resting on the floor and screamed that she had just spent thousands of dollars of stolen money on designer clothes while pretending to be a victim. They turned on each other with a viciousness that was difficult to watch. The perfect united front they had maintained for years disintegrated into a screaming match of mutual destruction. Bryce yelled that Delia was the one who suggested telling me the house was being foreclosed upon. Delia screamed back that Bryce was a pathetic failure who could not even run a simple delivery business without borrowing money from criminals. They were confessing to every single aspect of their conspiracy, each trying to assign the majority of the blame to the other. Bryce turned his panicked eyes back to me. He ignored his wife and tried to bargain. He begged me to call off the authorities. He promised he would get a job working manual labor to pay me back every single penny he had ever taken. He said they could move out of the state tonight and I would never have to see them again. He was practically on his knees, pleading for a way out of the concrete room he had built for himself. I watched the two of them scream and beg. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel any sorrow for the destruction of their marriage or the collapse of their fraudulent lives. I only felt a profound sense of validation. The silent adjustment was nearly complete. I had let them dig their own graves, and now they were actively shoveling the dirt onto each other. I did not need to raise my voice to stop their pathetic argument. I just needed to let them finish destroying themselves. I stood perfectly quiet at the head of the oak table, allowing their panicked confessions to echo through the large house. The trap had worked flawlessly. I allowed the screaming match to continue for several long minutes. Bryce and Delia were pacing around the dining room, tearing down their entire marriage right in front of me. They hurled vicious accusations back and forth, each trying to secure the role of the innocent victim. Bryce yelled that he only forged the medical evaluation because Delia pushed him to do it. Delia screamed that Bryce was a terrifying failure, who forced her to participate in the real estate fraud to save him from dangerous private lenders. They were completely blinded by their own selfish panic. They did not realize that they were giving me exactly what I needed. I did not yell over them. I did not demand order. I simply stood at the head of the oak table and let them exhaust their lungs. When you audit financial criminals, you learn a very important lesson about human nature. Guilty people cannot stand silence. If you let them talk, they will eventually confess to everything in a desperate attempt to justify their actions. I watched my daughter and her husband unravel completely. Their faces were red and their voices were growing. Bryce was sweating profusely, and Delia was shaking with a frantic energy. Finally, they ran out of things to yell. They stood on opposite sides of the room, breathing heavily, glaring at each other with pure hatred. The quiet returned to the house, settling over us like a heavy, thick blanket. That was the exact moment I made my move. I reached my right hand slowly into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. Bryce and Delia flinched, assuming I was reaching for a weapon or perhaps a phone to call the authorities. I did not pull out a phone. I pulled out a small silver digital voice recorder. I held it in the palm of my hand for a moment, letting them see it clearly. Then I leaned forward and placed it gently on the polished wood of the dining room table. The device made a soft clicking sound as it made contact with the oak surface. There was a tiny red light glowing brightly on the top of the device. It was blinking in a slow, steady rhythm. It had been blinking since the exact second they walked through the front door with their bottles of champagne. It had captured their entire celebratory conversation about the forged signature. It had recorded their cruel discussion about leaving their son locked in the basement to break his spirit. And most importantly, it had just captured their entire hysterical screaming match, where they explicitly detailed their individual roles in the conspiracy. Every single confession, every admission of forgery, and every threat was now securely stored as a high-definition digital file. Delia stared at the blinking red light, as if it were a bomb about to detonate. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The last remaining drops of defiance drained out of her body, leaving her completely hollow. Bryce stumbled forward and stared down at the small silver machine. His hands twitched at his sides. I could see the exact thought crossing his mind. He was calculating whether he could lunge across the table, grab the recorder, and smash it into pieces. I looked him directly in the eyes and told him not to even think about it. I kept my voice incredibly calm and perfectly measured. I told Bryce that grabbing the device would be a tremendous waste of his energy. I explained that the recorder was not just saving the audio to an internal memory card. It was actively transmitting the data to a secure cloud server managed by my attorney. I told him that my friend Roland was sitting in his downtown law office right now, listening to every single word they had said. The evidence was already miles away, securely logged and legally admissible. The fight completely left Bryce. His shoulders slumped forward, and he buried his face in his hands. He let out a low, agonizing groan that sounded like a dying animal. He finally understood the absolute totality of his failure. There was no maneuvering out of this situation. There were no more lies he could tell. The digital footprint was perfectly clear, and the verbal confession was irrevocably sealed. Delia took a slow, shaky step toward me. She reached out a trembling hand as if she wanted to touch my arm. She whispered the word "Dad," looking at me with eyes full of desperate, pleading tears. She was trying to summon the ghost of the father-daughter relationship she had just destroyed. She wanted me to look at her and see the little girl I used to read bedtime stories to. She wanted grace and forgiveness. I did not step back, but I did not reach out to comfort her. I looked at the woman standing in front of me and felt a profound, chilling emptiness. I told Delia that she lost the right to call me her father, the exact moment she helped force a terrified 15-year-old boy down those basement stairs. I told her that a parent is supposed to protect their child from the monsters in the world. She had chosen to become the monster instead. I told her that she traded her family, her son and her soul, for a wire transfer that never even arrived. Delia collapsed onto the hardwood floor, weeping uncontrollably. She wrapped her arms around her knees and buried her face in her hands. Bryce remained frozen near the table, staring blankly at the wall. They were entirely broken. I had not raised my voice once. I had not hurled a single insult or thrown a single punch. I simply used their own greed and their own arrogance to completely dismantle their lives. I stood over them, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly executed audit. The numbers finally made sense. The liabilities had been exposed, and the fraudulent accounts were permanently closed. The final blow had been delivered with absolute silence. I checked the heavy brass clock in the hallway. It was getting late, and the final phase of the operation was rapidly approaching. I looked down at Bryce and Delia. I told them they might want to find a comfortable place to sit. I told them the evening was far from over, and they were going to need their strength for the visitors who were about to arrive. The silence in the dining room was broken by a sudden shift in the light. Bright flashes of red and blue pierced through the large front windows. The strobing colors swept across the pale walls of the hallway and illuminated the terrified faces of my daughter and her husband. The heavy silence was replaced by the low, steady rumble of powerful engines pulling into the sweeping gravel driveway. I did not move from my spot at the head of the table. I simply watched the flashing lights cast long, shifting shadows across the oak floor. Bryce slowly lifted his head from his hands. The strobing blue light caught the absolute panic in his wide eyes. He looked toward the front windows and then looked back at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. Delia remained on the floor. She turned her head toward the bright flashing colors and let out a soft, whimpering sound. The reality of the situation had finally breached the walls of their secure suburban bubble. This was no longer a private family dispute. The consequences of their greed had officially arrived at our front door. I looked at the two of them and explained exactly what was happening. I kept my voice perfectly calm, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over them. I told Bryce that my attorney, Roland, had not just been filing court injunctions and freezing bank accounts this afternoon. I explained that Roland had spent the last few hours coordinating directly with local law enforcement and the county prosecutor. He had handed over the forged real estate contracts, the fabricated medical evaluations, and the digital trail of stolen money. But I made sure to emphasize the most important piece of evidence. I told them that the police were not just here for the financial crimes. I explained that the authorities had already visited the home of my lawn care worker, Silas. They had sat down in a quiet living room and taken a full official statement from a terrified 15-year-old boy. They knew exactly what happened in the basement. They knew about the crushed cell phone, the physical force, and the heavy reinforced door. The sound of heavy boots echoed across the wooden planks of the front porch. A loud, authoritative knock rattled the front door. It was a firm, demanding sound that required immediate compliance. Bryce froze, completely unable to take a single step. Delia pressed her face against her knees, refusing to look up. I walked past them, my footsteps steady and deliberate. I reached the front door and pulled it open. 4 uniformed police officers stood on my porch. Their radios crackled with dispatch chatter. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, asked if I was Harlan. I nodded and stepped aside, gesturing toward the dining room. The officers entered the house with purposeful strides. The heavy equipment on their utility belts clattered softly in the quiet hallway. They moved past the expensive foyer decorations and stepped directly into the light of the crystal chandelier. The lead officer addressed Bryce and Delia. He did not yell, but his voice carried absolute authority. He asked them to confirm their identities. Bryce managed a weak, pathetic nod. Delia could not even speak. She simply stayed huddled on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. The officer instructed Bryce to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Bryce tried to protest. His voice was a weak, raspy whisper. He pleaded with the officers, claiming it was all a terrible misunderstanding. He said they were a respectable family, and that this was just a private financial matter. The officers did not entertain his lies for a single second. One of them stepped forward, grabbed Bryce by the arm, and spun him around. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply through the dining room. It was the absolute final sound of his fabricated empire crumbling. Two other officers approached Delia. They instructed her to stand up. She resisted at first, clinging to the leg of the dining chair, weeping and begging me to make them stop. She cried out for her father, pleading for a second chance. I stood in the archway of the kitchen and watched my daughter with a cold, empty heart. I told her that she made her choices when she locked her son in the dark. The officers gently but firmly pulled her to her feet and secured her wrists in metal cuffs. The lead officer stood in the center of the room and read them their rights. He listed the charges with cold, bureaucratic precision. He stated they were being arrested for felony wire fraud, criminal forgery, and grand theft. But the charge that hung heaviest in the air, the one that made Bryce drop his head in total shame, was the final one. The officer stated they were also being charged with felony child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment. The officers guided them toward the front door. I followed closely behind, watching them shuffle down the hallway they used to walk through with such arrogant pride. When we reached the front porch, I stepped out into the warm evening air. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the entire street. Word travels fast in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The commotion had drawn the attention of the people living around my estate. I looked out past the police cruisers and saw dozens of neighbors standing on their manicured lawns and gathering on the sidewalks. These were the people who used to wave at Delia and Bryce. These were the people who admired their expensive leased cars and their perfectly tailored suits. Now they were standing in the warm summer evening, watching the perfect couple being escorted out of a house in steel handcuffs. Bryce kept his head down, refusing to look at the crowd. The humiliation of being paraded in front of his wealthy peers was the ultimate punishment for a man entirely obsessed with his image. Delia wept openly, her tears ruining her expensive makeup as the officers guided her into the back of a police cruiser. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing them in the back of the vehicles. I stood on the porch for a long time after the police cruisers disappeared around the bend. The red and blue reflections completely vanished from the trees, and the quiet sounds of the summer night slowly returned. The crickets began to chirp, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves of the large oak trees bordering the driveway. The sheer magnitude of what had transpired over the last 10 hours finally began to settle into my bones. I had woken up this morning as a retired engineer, enjoying a cup of diner coffee. I was ending the day having dismantled a federal fraud conspiracy and sending my own daughter to prison. There was no joy in the victory. There was no triumphant celebration. There was only the profound exhaustion of a man who had been forced to tear down his own family tree to save the roots. But as I looked across the dark driveway toward the empty guest house, a deep, powerful sense of peace washed over my chest. The toxic rot that had been quietly eating away at my family for years had been completely eradicated. The danger was gone. I turned away from the driveway and walked back into the foyer. I closed the heavy oak door and turned the deadbolt, securing the house. The crystal chandelier in the dining room was still shining brightly. I walked over to the table and picked up the small silver voice recorder. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling the solid weight of the truth resting against my side. It was time to leave the estate one last time tonight. I needed to drive across town. I needed to go to a quiet house where a 15-year-old boy was sitting on a couch, waiting for his grandfather to bring him home. 3 months have passed since the flashing red and blue lights faded from my driveway. I stood on my wide front porch this morning, holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. The oppressive heat of the summer has finally broken, giving way to the sharp, crisp winds of late autumn. The leaves on the large oak trees bordering the property have turned brilliant shades of amber and gold, covering the grass in a bright seasonal blanket. The estate is no longer trapped in a heavy, suffocating silence, or the tense atmosphere of impending disaster. It is filled with the loud, productive sounds of genuine hard work and transformation. Across the driveway, the guest house is currently crawling with local contractors. I hired a massive crew to completely gut the building from the inside out. They are tearing up the expensive imported tile, ripping down the custom light fixtures, and destroying the luxury kitchen cabinets Delia had installed when she first moved in. I am having them demolish every single trace of the fraudulent lifestyle my daughter and her husband tried to build on my property. We are taking down the interior walls to completely open up the floor plan. The entire structure is being renovated into a massive, dedicated game room and advanced computer laboratory for my grandson. I watched a worker carry the remnants of a designer vanity out to a large metal dumpster parked on the gravel. The loud crash of the wood hitting the steel bottom felt incredibly therapeutic. It was the sound of a toxic foundation being permanently removed from our lives. Delia and Bryce will never be coming back to reclaim any of those pieces. They are currently residing in separate federal detention facilities, waiting for their official sentencing hearings. The state and federal prosecutors did not show them a single ounce of mercy, and they offered no lenient plea deals. The mountain of evidence Roland and I provided was absolutely airtight. The digital tracking of the financial fraud, the forged notary stamps, the audio recordings of their confessions, and the devastating sworn statement provided by their own son left their expensive defense attorneys with absolutely nothing to argue in a court of law. They are facing severe sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison for felony wire fraud, criminal forgery, and felony child endangerment. The financial fallout of their failed conspiracy was just as absolute and devastating. Their personal bank accounts were completely frozen and permanently seized by the government to pay massive court fines and legal restitution. The dangerous private lenders they owed aggressively liquidated whatever minor physical assets they had left in their possession. The luxury leased cars Bryce used to drive around the suburban neighborhood, pretending to be a successful tycoon, were repossessed by the dealerships weeks ago. They are facing total and complete bankruptcy, without a single penny left to their names. They gambled their entire family structure, their freedom, and their child for a massive payout, and they lost absolutely everything. I have not visited the detention centers to see them in their prison uniforms. I have refused every single collect call that comes through my phone from the county jail. I spent 45 years protecting my daughter, providing for her, and trying to guide her toward an honest, respectable life. That chapter of my life is permanently closed, and the book has been thrown away. I do not feel any guilt about leaving them to face the cold, concrete reality of their terrible decisions. They built their own cages long before the police ever arrived. The most important change over the past 3 months has been the establishment of a completely new normal for my family. We went to family court a few weeks after the initial arrests were made. The judge reviewed the harrowing evidence of child endangerment and looked at the overwhelming proof of my financial stability and emotional dedication. I was immediately granted full, permanent legal custody of my grandson. Micah has moved out of the guest house entirely and taken over the largest upstairs bedroom in the primary residence. The physical and emotional transformation in him over these past few months has been nothing short of miraculous. Without the crushing weight of his parents and their constant web of lies pressing down on his shoulders, he has finally learned how to breathe and relax again. He is back to building his complex software projects, studying hard for his high school classes, and looking toward a bright, promising future. He has started teaching me a little bit about software coding, showing me how the logic of a computer program is not so different from the structural blueprints I used to draw for my civil engineering projects. We have built a genuine connection based on shared interests and mutual trust. The dark shadow of that terrifying basement is slowly fading from his eyes, replaced by the quiet, confident demeanor of a young man who knows he is deeply loved and fiercely protected. We spend our evenings cooking dinner together and talking about our days, repairing the damage that his parents left behind, step by step. As I stood on the porch watching the contractors throw debris into the dumpster, I heard the familiar, steady hum of a lawnmower starting up near the back gardens. Silas is back on the estate today, completing his weekly landscaping duties. He never stopped working for me after the incident. When I drove across town that terrible night to pick up my grandson, Silas and his mother flatly refused to accept any more of my money. They had fed Micah, kept him completely safe from harm, and treated him like a member of their own family when his biological parents treated him like an inconvenience and a prisoner. I walked down the porch steps and headed toward the back lawn, holding a cold bottle of water. I waited patiently for Silas to finish a long row of grass before I caught his attention. He cut the engine and wiped his sweating forehead with a rag. I handed him the water, and we stood together in the crisp autumn air, talking casually about his college classes and his ambitious career plans for the upcoming semester. He is no longer just the young man I hire to cut the grass and edge the walkways. He is a highly respected ally who proved his incredible character and integrity when the situation mattered most. I walked back to the front porch and looked out over the vast green expanse of my property. I used to believe that family was a simple matter of biology and shared history. I thought that because Delia was my daughter, she would automatically carry the values of honesty and integrity that my late wife and I tried to instill in her. I learned the hardest and most painful way possible that family is not defined by bloodlines, birth certificates, or last names. Family is defined by mutual respect, absolute truth, and a fierce willingness to protect one another from the darkness in the world. I lost my daughter to the blinding poison of greed and arrogant entitlement. There is a quiet, heavy sadness in that absolute truth that I will carry for the rest of my life. But as I hear the front door open behind me and listen to my grandson walk out onto the porch to join me in the morning sun, I know I made the only right choice. I tore down my own family tree to eradicate the toxic rot. But in doing so, I saved my grandson, and ultimately, I saved myself. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional compliance. We are often taught to forgive our relatives simply because they are family, allowing them to cross boundaries that we would never accept from a stranger. But greed and manipulation do not deserve a free pass just because they share your last name. Protecting your peace, your dignity, and the innocent people in your life requires you to stand firm in the truth. True love requires boundaries. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let toxic people face the absolute consequences of their own destructive actions. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more true stories about standing up for what is right.